Good afternoon. I think we're about ready to begin the session, and I hope that everyone can hear. In that case, we'll continue. First, let me express my appreciation. I'm Mark Schneider. I'm the Senior Vice President of the International Crisis Group, and I want to express my appreciation to the World Bank for allowing me to moderate this panel, which, as you will hear, also is one of the subjects that Crisis Group is about to launch a new series of reports on in the next several weeks. This panel, particularly this workshop on violent extremism and development, what we know and what we don't, includes very distinguished researchers who will be presenting some of their own findings and those of others who have been seeking to explore the questions that I think that all of us are asking: how to prevent violent extremism, and how to halt the multiple extremist forces that have expanded in an arc from Central Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa with deadly and horrific consequences. Now, as you know, Crisis Group came into being because our founders believed that too often major powers and international organizations ignored the cables, however incomplete they might be, coming from places like Rwanda or Srebrenica or the Congo. After the Cold War, without strategic linkages, those places seem to be far removed from the concerns of those major powers. We're independent, nonpartisan, non-governmental, and global with a methodology that's based on field-based analysis, design of policies aimed at preventing conflict, and advocacy of our findings and our recommendations directly to decision makers. Jean-Marie Gaheno, our current president, as many of you know, was the former Undersecretary General of the United Nations for Peacekeeping under Kofi Annan, and some of you may have heard his moderation today of the early morning session, virtually on the same subject, or very related. Our board of international and leaders includes 6 former heads of state and 8 former defense and foreign ministers. And we publish some 60 reports each year. I direct the ICG Washington office, and we have a similar office in New York focused on really the Security Council, but the UN generally, and in Brussels, where our global headquarters interacts with the European Union. We have a similar office in London that also does outreach into the European capitals. The phenomenon of violent extremism is really expanding within the chaos of existing conflicts. And the extremists are by no means constrained by the borders of nation states, most of which they reject entirely. The explosion of refugees around and across the Mediterranean to Europe is one consequence of our failure to find policies sufficient to control that flow. The upheaval of altered regional political dynamics threatening existing state structures is another consequence. Across the Middle East, the Islamist State, Al-Qaeda, and a growing number of groups using unrestrained violence against state authorities and civilian populations have raised existential fears in some cases. For the international community, there's no option to ignore what is happening. But there's also a need, which I think to some degree our scholars here today have begun, and which Crisis Group also is attempting, and that is a serious assessment of the nature and magnitude of the threat and an analysis of the responses in order to ensure that they do not yield more adherence by their actions than those they discourage. Drawing from our experience over various regions where we do field-based reporting, we're working, as I said, on a cross-cutting series of reports. The first one will be out in 2 weeks. I would have said a few weeks. Jean-Marie said 2 weeks, so I think you can expect to see the report on the 14th of March. And it'll essentially focus violent extremism in the local and regional conflicts that exist today, how they've emerged, and to examine to some degree the geopolitics that complicates efforts to contain them. It'll examine the local dynamics of violent extremism, patterns of radicalization, how extremists gain influence, their impact on crises, and the threat they pose elsewhere. And as I said, we'll be looking at how past responses have often aggravated the problem, with an eye to developing more effective and sustainable options. And a priority of our work, and I suspect a priority of the work of the World Bank and of the analysts that are here today, is how do you shore up the states along the belt most affected by these crises and by extremism, particularly those that have not yet succumbed but are still vulnerable. And what we're really looking for is both how they interact with local and regional dynamics, how they exploit crises, and on the positive side, I'd like to know which targeted development, governance, justice, and other policies and programs can help reduce their ability to gain more adherence, and how they can help nation states and the communities at the local level as well deepen their own capabilities in terms of social cohesion and reduce the nature of exclusion and grievances that underlie much of the extremism that we've seen. Knowing what works and what doesn't is absolutely critical to prevent violent extremist groups from gaining ground, from destroying more innocent lives, and from endangering state structures. And to answer some of those questions, or at least to throw light on the nature of those questions, let me present our distinguished panel. We're going to start with Dr. Michael Gilligan, who is professor of politics at New York University. He's conducted research on post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation in Burundi, Nepal, Liberia, Cambodia, and the Ivory Coast, and is a professor of politics at New York University. He's completed 2 randomized program evaluations for the World Bank, one on a community-driven development program in Sudan, and one on self-help groups in Cambodia. And his research in Burundi produced a quasi-experimental study of the ex-combatant reintegration program there, which is part of the World Bank's multi-donor reconstruction program in the Great Lakes region of Africa. His current research, which I'm sure we're going to hear about, focuses on how insurgent movements use social incentives to overcome collective action and principal agent dilemmas that cannot be solved by economic motivators alone.
Thank you, Mark. That's better. Glasses are supposed to help me see, but if I can't find them, it's okay. Violent extremism, what we know and what we don't know. So I've geared this talk, since I'm speaking inside the World Bank building, and I've had a lot of dealings with the World Bank, some which have produced randomized evaluations, others which haven't, for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that I've noticed about the World Bank is that as soon as you come in here and you start talking to people at the World Bank, most of whom are often economists or business people, you start hearing about jobs and value chains and infrastructure and all sorts of things. And then you ask them, what do you want to get out of the program? And they say, well, we want to build social capital, or we want to build social cohesion. Or, in this case, we want to stop violent extremism, right? So I hope I'm not offending anyone when I say, in my personal experience, this is an organization that has a hammer and goes around banging on a lot of nails that aren't nails. And so my remarks are geared toward that. You know, it's funny. I mean, I remember when I was brought in and all of the post-conflict reconstruction stuff was done, and it was all about building infrastructure and ensuring jobs to reconstitute the social fabric of these war-torn countries, and it never worked. And now we've moved on to what are we going to do? We're going to combat violent extremism, and what's the toolkit? Well, it's jobs and it's infrastructure programs and things of that nature. So I'm going to try to get us to think outside the box, and I'm speaking to the choir a bit because we've got psychologists and criminologists and other political scientists and a lot of other people here, so I don't want to tar you all with the same brush, but let the tarring begin. I think we have a pretty good idea about what doesn't work, and that is jobs programs. Every RCT that I'm familiar with, and in the quasi-experiment that Mark kindly mentioned that I was involved in Burundi, the most damning thing I can say about these programs is that they all worked at building jobs, but none of them worked at making better citizens, right? So we can't just say that these programs are a failure. They work. They work at what you guys are good at, which is making jobs. The best predictor of whether you were above the poverty line in Burundi as a part of the MDRP program was whether you were in the DDR program. It worked. Now, 8 years later, those same guys are picking up guns in the same civil war. It's not that the whole thing is misconceived. It works at creating jobs, but there is a disconnect somewhere between the job creation and the making people not be violent extremists. The one exception I can think of that is a study by Jeannie Annan and Chris Blattman of a program in Liberia which took the psychosocial aspects of this very seriously. There was a heavy cognitive behavioral therapy component to it, and they basically reprogrammed these guys from being mercenaries and criminals and into just regular citizens. Okay? And so I think we do know that regular jobs programs don't work. This one, because it had this other thing mixed in, did, but that's one study. We need a lot more of this before we can be sure that this wasn't just some weird thing about Liberia or something else. I'm going to give you, since I can't tell you what does work for sure, I'm going to give you a hypothesis about what I think is the problem here, and it is that violent extremist groups offer more than a job. They offer meaning to people's lives. When I was a kid, this is for you, Jake. When I was a kid, the Navy's motto, how they tried to get young men, this was after Vietnam War, they had a very hard time getting people to join up. Their motto was, it's not just a job, it's an adventure. I don't know if that worked. That doesn't quite get at what I'm trying to say, because an adventure, people aren't just in this for adventure, right, which could conceivably be self-indulgent, but what's the Navy's slogan now? The Navy, a global force for good, right? So you join the Navy, it's not just a job, you're going to be a superhero, man. You are going to go around from country to country and save people's lives, right? That's how they're trying to motivate people. They're not saying, hey, you get to make, $350 a month more than you would flipping burgers at McDonald's. That's not how they're selling this, okay? I think about my own students at New York University. I teach a lot of honors students in the International Relations program. These people could be going out making 6 digits at Citibank or wherever, and a lot of them do that. I'm not saying my description here is of every young person on the face of the earth, and a lot of them do that, but a lot of them take unpaid internships at the World Bank. A lot of them join the Peace Corps or Teach for America or go off into some, woebegone place, to deworm kids. Or, these guys could be jobs are not the issue for these people, right? Making a difference, having a meaning to your life makes a difference to these people. And I think we sometimes forget that, in part because a lot of the programmers are old and we forget what it's like to be 21 years old. We get a different set of priorities, but also, here in the West, a mainly white-collar economy, a lot of us automatically have meaning in our lives, right? The woman who's teaching 6-year-olds to read, what could be more meaningful than that? The nurse that's helping sick people, right? The research that you guys are doing, your lives have this meaning already. So it's not surprising that you would forget how important this is to you, but I challenge the economists in the group and the bankers out here with the following fact, which is that you could probably be making a lot more money at TD Bank or Chase or Citibank, but you chose this job. Why did you choose this job? Because you want to help poor people, right? You gave up money for that. So And I'm not saying there's a lot of people that chose Citibank, right? I'm not saying this is everybody. But there is a certain sort of person that needs meaning in their lives more than other sorts of people. And I'm saying that those are the kinds of people we need to be targeting. And those aren't going to be the kinds of people that are going to be swayed by, wow, you mean I don't join ISIS and I get a job fixing motorcycles? I mean, that's not what's motivating these folks. In case that wasn't obnoxious enough, let me show you a picture of some violent extremists. These guys they were certainly violent, and certainly for 1776, they were very extremist, right? Now, we don't think of them that way anymore. We think of them as heroes, and they were. I want to be absolutely crystal clear. I am not equating these folks and these folks. Do not put those words in my mouth. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, can we entertain the thought that perhaps what is motivating these guys motivated these guys? That these people really aren't that different from us, or a large chunk of us. That they're motivated by much the same thing that these people were. And what do we know about these people, right? We know that if the Brits had come in and offered a jobs program, none of these guys would have taken it, right? We know, and I'm not just talking about the big tall guy standing up, these guys, we know a lot about those guys pulling on the oars. We know that they were fishermen, mainly from Marblehead, Massachusetts. They were very good fishermen. They were making a good living. In terms of caloric intake, at least before the war started, they were doing way better than the redcoats that had just chased them all the way up the island of Manhattan and then all the way down the state of New Jersey. So these guys weren't motivated because they didn't have a job or because their life sucked. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this isn't just kids with time on their hands, and this isn't just disgruntlement over a bad situation. Somebody comes along and tells a kid like this, who's herding sheep in Iraq somewhere, just like his grandfather, just like his great-grandfather did before that, and says, the world is telling you you're a sheep herder. I'm telling you you are a hero. You can have an effect on the most profound activity that is happening in the world today. That God wants you to go and restore the caliphate, right? And if you're this kid and you're of the right type, you're an adventuresome sort, that's going to sound pretty good, right? And he's got a job already. He's herding goats, right? He's obviously probably from a fairly wealthy family. I'm not saying he did join ISIS, but I mean, it's, the idea is that that's not the only thing. There's a certain class of people who join extremist movements who need something else. They need meaning. And so, just so you don't think it's just me blabbing up here, I have actually done some research on this. I didn't just download a bunch of pictures off the internet. I've now done work with groups around the world, bringing them into a laboratory sort of setting to measure their levels of prosociality. This particular data, which I'm going to explain in a little greater detail in a minute, is from Maoist insurgents in Nepal who were considered violent extremists 10 years ago. They were on the U.S. terrorist list. Now their military leader is the vice president of the country. And what we did is we had them play a bunch of games or simulations to try to get at how pro-social these people are, both toward each other in some cases and also toward just regular citizens. And the answer was they're very pro-social. And it's a little hard to tell here, but what you're getting here is the number of years they served in the Maoist movement and how much they gave to a collective good, in a collective good sort of setting. And you can see it's increasing. Now there's at least two reasons why it could be increasing. There's other reasons as well, but the two reasons that it happens to be increasing like that is, first of all, people who are more pro-social joined earlier. So the more you cared about the oppressed classes, which is what this was all about, the earlier you joined. And so that's why some of it's upward sloping. It's a phenomenon of that self-selection process, right? And we need to take that self-selection process very seriously, because these people were willing to leave their farms, their homes, their families to go fight for the oppressed classes, right? Giving them a better job was not going to supply that for them, right? So these people cared, you know, take them at their word. They were fighting to liberate the oppressed classes. Now, you know, they're not lying to you. The other reason it's upward sloping is that they were indoctrinated as part of the movement, right? So every morning they'd wake up and they would be read to from Marx. They would be told how important it was to serve the oppressed classes, and they lived what they preached. No one wore insignia. The general ate in the mess with everybody else. And I can tell you from personal experience, these are wonderful people. I mean, just lovely people. The first time I ever had an experience with them, I was meeting a guy named Ganesh Manpoon, who was a colonel and later became head of the Young Communist League there. And we brought him in. He was meeting us at the hotel to, you know, we were interviewing him. And we had these really fancy NYU pens made up to sort of give them as a token of thanks for taking time from their busy schedule and meeting us. They gave the guy the pen. The first thing he did was turn to his driver and give him the pen, right? So we sat down, we ordered coffee, cookies, all of that. Before he ordered, he made sure everybody else got what they ordered. So this guy, it struck me at that point that this guy, he's a nice guy. He's very pro-social. And that was an N of one, obviously, but then when we went and did this with a couple of hundred Maoist leaders, we found that exactly the same thing seemed to be going on. And it was the longer they were in this movement, the more they were like this. Now, subsequently, I've gone and done this in the Ivory Coast with various groups, found the same thing. I'm going to be going to Kurdistan in a couple of months to do this with Peshmerga, and I presume I'll find the same thing, at least from the ones who joined before 2003. And if the Department of Treasury gives me my OFAC license, I'm going to be doing this with Al-Qassam fighters this summer. So if there's anyone from the Treasury Department out there who knows somebody, trust me, I'm a good guy. I'm not. But the problem is that these activities are all incentivized with money, and so I can't just start handing out shekels to Al-Qassam members without getting myself in some serious trouble. So that's my point. Not the shekels part, but my point is that these people are different. They're motivated socially, right? They want to do good. And unfortunately, in the places where they live, and I've also done a lot of work on this, there aren't a lot of opportunities for them to do that. You know, another reason why we take it for granted in the West is not just that we mostly have white-collar jobs which allow us to help other people all the time, but even if we don't, we have organizations through church, through PTA, through all sorts of things to nonviolently fulfill that innate human need for meaning, for doing something larger than ourselves. I've been all over a couple of places in Sudan, and they don't have it. There's nothing. Well, check that. There's one thing. There's the mosque. Right? That's the one place where you could be, if you were so inclined, steering these folks toward a more pro-social way and a less violent way of meeting this innate human need for meaning and to be good, to help your fellow man and woman, right? Unfortunately, that particular avenue has been co-opted in many places, and that's kind of the problem, right? So what would I say is the solution? Well, first solution is somebody give me a lot more money so that I can go out and make sure I'm right. But after that, in a bunch of other places, but assuming I am right, the solution, it's not a solution that we can necessarily employ, right? Because we can't go and tell them you're not being pro-social, that the group that you think is doing a good thing is really doing an awful thing. Right? That's got to come from inside somewhere. That's got to come from the mosque. Right? That we need leaders there who are willing to stand up and say, I know you want to serve God, but this is not the way to do it. Okay? And a jobs program isn't going to solve that problem. We need to somehow create a counterbalance, when maybe we don't need to create it, maybe they need to create it themselves, or at least encourage or foster it within these communities to give people an outlet to do what I believe is the most human of emotions, which is to take care of each other. We need to do that as human beings and help each other. And until that is, and unfortunately right now, these people think they're helping each other by restoring the caliphate in very, very violent ways. And that's not good, right? So what we need to do is we need to get another voice in there. That's my humble opinion and 2 cents. So again, it's a bit straying off the title because we don't know this. I need to do more research. But I got to say that what I've done so far is very much pointing in this direction, that you need to take this social aspect seriously. People, psychopaths set aside, want to help other people. And these folks are tapping into that desire and misdirecting it and doing bad things with it. And that's my 2 cents about where we ought to go.
Associate Professor of Political Science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at City University of New York, and Senior Fellow at the Global Center on Cooperative Security. His recent work with the Global Center includes the reports Does CVE Work? Lessons Learned from the Global Effort to Counter Violent Extremism, and Preventing Violent Extremism in Burkina Faso Toward National Resilience Amid Regional Insecurity. He holds a bachelor's and LLB from the University of Adelaide, South Australia, and a master's and PhD in political science from Brown University. Peter.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation to participate today. In my remarks today, I thought I would address directly the 2 questions that are raised indirectly in the chapeau paragraph that describes this workshop. That is to say, what is the state of knowledge on violent extremism, and what are the implications for development actors? I'll be, in my remarks, talking about 2 projects that we have been working on. The first is a recently completed project funded by Public Safety Canada, which yielded the report, Does CVE Work? Lessons Learned from the Global Effort to Counter Violent Extremism. In this report, we took a very straightforward approach, which is to say, we gathered... Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Is that better? Yeah? Okay. The first project that I'll talk about is a completed project that yielded the report, Does CVE Work? In this report, what we did was to gather evaluations of CVE programming, that is formal program evaluations of CVE measures that are on the public record. We put them all together and developed a typology of CVE measures and see if we could learn some lessons on the basis of evaluation research. Some of those evaluations included measures undertaken by development actors. I noticed a colleague from USAID before, and I'll just mention that USAID, among the world's development actors, has of course been quite active in this space, and to their immense credit has committed resources to evaluation. The second project that I'll talk about is an ongoing project for the East Africa Research Fund of UK DFID. This is a 10-country study of the drivers of radicalisation and violent extremism. The 10-country sample includes everything from Djibouti to Mozambique. Most of the work we're doing is desk-based research, and indeed it's framed as a literature review, but we have the opportunity to do field work in Tanzania and Uganda. We did the Tanzania leg in January, we'll do the Uganda leg in April. In both of these projects, we've had the opportunity to reflect upon the state of knowledge on violent extremism and the emergence of the field of CVE. And in particular, we've had the opportunity to reflect on the role of development actors in this field. So what's the state of knowledge on violent extremism? Let me try to sum that up in 5 points. This field has obviously grown very quickly in the post-9/11 period. But if there's one clear finding, it's that there's no quick answers to the pressing questions that we face. There's been a strong demand for knowledge, but supply has been decidedly mixed, to the point where in 2014, one of the sort of senior figures in the field, Mark Sageman, who is probably aptly described as a little bit of a muckraker, made the sort of ad hominem attack that we've reached a point of stagnation. And indeed, I'd be interested to know what my fellow panelists think, but my own view is that it's been a little while since we've had a theoretical or empirical or methodological breakthrough in this space. And indeed, I think that, in terms of thinking about the causes of terrorism, what we now call the drivers of violent extremism, this is very much a field of inquiry that's in its infancy. Now, it sounds very professorial for somebody like me to get up and say, it's important to define terms, but the fact is that if we don't know what our dependent variable is and we don't know what our independent variables are, or if we as a community of researchers can't agree on those definitions, then that's an impediment to the growth of knowledge. Doing the 10-country study of East Africa, this is very important, right? I mean, the Global Terrorism Database, the major database in the field, has a very permissive definition of what counts as terrorism, although it has the ability to sort of pass it back. But looking across the 10 countries in East Africa, we've had to ask ourselves, what counts as violent extremism? Armed groups in that region are really quite diverse and distinctive. So we've had to think carefully about what our dependent variable is. Some people in this field like to disaggregate violent extremism per se from violent Islamist extremism, which is VIE. Among the researchers that have waded into this area to date, there's no consensus about a definition of CVE, I think. It's a very broad and permissive field that covers everything from women's rights and maternal health programs to soccer balls and mosquito nets to intervention programs for at-risk and vulnerable youth. It's really quite a broad scope. An important distinction, especially in this forum, is to disaggregate CVE-specific programs, that is, programs formed directly to counter violent extremism, to act directly against violent extremism, as opposed to CVE-relevant programs, which are measures that address the background conditions that yield violent extremism. And I'll say in a moment that I think it's much more apt for development actors to think in terms of CVE-relevant, of course, rather than CVE-specific measures. Another term that I was pleased that Mark used the term social capital and social cohesion. In the CVE space, it's very common to talk about resilience, as indeed it is in other fields of inquiry, whether it's in response to global warming or natural disasters. But I get the sense in this field that we haven't really thought much about what resilience to violent extremism is, whether it's different from or similar to other forms of resilience, and so on. There are also significant challenges in building theory in this field. Everybody that's sort of studied this field seriously has come back and said, there's no A plus B equals C here. This field is characterized by causal complexity and context specificity. I'm very wary speaking to an audience of policymakers, expecting that eyes glaze over once those kinds of words are used. But the fact is that, there's no straightforward formula that leads to violent extremism. A basic approach in the field that has a very long history in sort of pre-9/11 terrorism studies is to disaggregate levels of analysis, to talk about structural conditions or macro-level factors, to talk about meso, societal or organizational level factors, and to talk about individual level factors as my colleague Mark just did. And to say, we need to apply a logic of combinations. There's some causal factors at these different levels that seem to combine in different ways in different locations to yield this specific form of violence that we're interested in, violent extremism. We need to acknowledge also that the knowledge in this field has developed in, I think, a somewhat biased kind of way. It's easier to do research on macro-level factors, and so you find that there's an oversupply of that kind of research. It's much easier to do studies of returned foreign terrorist fighters in Sweden or Germany or the UK or Australia than it is to really figure out why people join Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, right? So there's a bit of a Western bias. The field of terrorism studies commits, I think, the original methodological sin of selecting on the dependent variable. We see terrorism, we want to explain it, but we don't spend enough time trying to explain the absence of terrorism, right? I think this goes back to the notion of resilience. It's also the case that, I described CVE a moment ago as being a broad and permissive kind of field. But the research in this area is actually quite stovepiped. The people that talk about the drivers of violent extremism, the people that talk in the CVE space, largely talk to themselves. And I think I give Alice and her colleagues a lot of credit for organising this panel because it's important that those of us that work on violent extremism and identify as such, learn lessons from those that study other forms of violence and responses to it. So the picture I'm giving is a little bit bleak, but obviously we have the challenge of trying to apply this knowledge in across these 10 cases in East Africa. And what we've tried to do is firstly to define what the problem is. And here the bigger databases actually are really not extremely helpful, not particularly helpful. The Global Terrorism Database, treats a lot of different armed groups across these 10 countries as violent extremism, where it's, pretty clear to us that there's probably not a single or a group of unified causes that lead to the LRA, at the same time to Al-Shabaab, at the same time to the ORF, and so on. But we've come up with this sort of general proposition, which is that violent extremism is a function of the prevalence of violent extremist ideas and groups and societal resilience amid permissive structural conditions, right? That is to say, if you look across these 10 countries, there's no shortage of people with grievances. There's no shortage of people with legitimate grievances. These are, per the Danu and Carter, the USAID Drivers of Violent Extremism materials, these are political grievances, they're socio-economic grievances, and they're cultural grievances. But those grievances only manifest themselves in violent extremism in very specific circumstances as a result of direct or indirect contact with existing extremists, mostly Al-Shabaab. Okay?
Watching us.
Lucky just the lights went out, right? But with this 10-country sample, we have to explain, the failure of violent extremism to emerge in specific countries. And for example, the fieldwork in Tanzania was absolutely fascinating because if you've read anything about terrorism in Tanzania since 1998, it's a lot of people, a chorus of people saying how vulnerable Tanzania is to violent extremism, right? But actually, examples of Tanzanians, I told people over there are more Australians that have joined ISIS than there are Tanzanians, right? There are maybe a dozen cases of Tanzanians on the record as going to join Al-Shabaab. Why is Tanzania sort of a non-war country, whereas Kenya next door is so violent? Okay, it probably has something about has something to do with Al-Shabaab's capacity and something to do with proximity. But also, if you put this question when we put this question to our interviewees in Tanzania, they described the sort of long history of nation building in that country. They described the importance of Swahili as a single language. They recalled President Nyerere fondly initially, but then out come the criticisms. But there's something there. There's a sense of resilience, and that's what we've been really interested in exploring. So what are the implications for development actors in this field? Suffice it to note that if we don't know what causes the phenomenon that we're interested in, then those responding should be duly careful. Okay, it's not obvious that development actors need a specific response to violent extremism, but at the same time, I would suggest that much of what development actors do is already relevant to violent extremism. Okay. Development actors also need to be mindful that violent extremism is probably not the most urgent form of violence in many of the contexts where you work, right? There is a sense of, and I'm a self-loathing CVE guy in this regard, there is a sense of faddishness about CVE. I deeply believe that Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram and ISIS are problems that we're going to be dealing with for a very long time. But CVE has emerged very quickly. and we need to address it with perspective and in context where other forms of violence are going to persist as well. I think it's important to proceed systematically. The figure that I've got here is from the Does CVE Work report that I mentioned a moment ago, where we thought it would be useful to present, a basic Public Policy 101 CVE policy cycle. That is to say, an assessment phase, a policy development phase, an implementation phase, and an evaluation phase, right? At the moment, in this field, policy development and implementation are much better developed than assessment and evaluation. That should give us pause, right? The assessment phase is the phase where, knowing that this field is in its infancy, let's devote some resources to studying the problem. If we know the problem is context specific, let's figure out what the context is. Let's map the initiatives that are already in place, right? In terms of thinking about appropriate responses. Right? And then that's at the front end. At the back end, let's evaluate. We should anticipate in this field that we're going to be learning some lessons, right? And so let's put ourselves in position to learn those lessons and integrate them back into the policy cycle. I think for development actors, it would be very helpful to begin a discussion about violent extremism and CVE internally. Given that the field has emerged quickly, I think that an internal discussion can help take stock of what existing measures are CVE relevant, can help avoid an overreaction, but also avoid overlap and enable development actors to leverage the mechanisms or the measures that are already in place. The evaluation research on CVE that has been done to date, more in a domestic context than admittedly in a global south context, has shown that CVE can have unintended consequences. I think for actors entering this field, it's important to know what those unintended consequences can be and to try to avoid them. A basic one, for example, is to avoid stigmatizing vulnerable communities. And so it's good to be aware of that in advance. There is, in our experience, occasionally conflict between sort of more traditional counterterrorism tools and this sort of newer CVE ideas. A classic example of that, I think, is the work that we've been doing over the years on the implementation of FATF Recommendation 8 that aims to suppress terrorist financing through the non-profit sector. When different governments come to implement Recommendation 8, as they're all eager to do, of course, they tend to have a mollifying effect on civil society. And it's unfortunate and ironic that in the counter-terrorist financing space, the same actors that are at the wrong end of the counter-terrorism equation are exactly the actors that make good partners and important partners for doing CVE. So don't beat up on civil society in the name of countering terrorist financing. Develop partnerships with civil society in the name of CVE. And as that comment suggests, I think it's really important to engage civil society, both as necessary partners, because governments can't do this stuff themselves, in terms of elaborating a counter-narrative. Governments lack a measure of credibility that civil society actors may possess. It's also important to engage civil society as a way of addressing the political grievances that very often underlie violent extremist narratives, and that's very much the case in East Africa. So to conclude, I've given a critical, but I don't want to come across as being too negative about the prospects for CVE. Actually, my own opinion is that CVE is an idea whose time has come, and that the focus on prevention is entirely appropriate, especially given the decade of counterterrorism that preceded it. Development actors do, I think, have an important, important work to improve people's lives, and reducing violent extremism can be a part of that in many of the places where you work. So proceed carefully, but proceed. And in that regard, I fully expect that some of the work that development actors do, especially in governance-related fields, will increasingly be seen to be CVE relevant in the short and medium term. So thanks very much.
and analyzes. Jacob Shapiro. At Princeton. Analyzes micro-level conflict data and other information on politically motivated violence in 9 countries. His active research projects focus on political violence, economic political development, security policy. He's the author of The Terrorist Dilemma, Managing Violent Covert Organizations. He also, prior to becoming an academic, Dr. Shapiro served in the U.S. Navy and Naval Reserve. He has his Ph.D. in political science and master's in economics from Stanford and a bachelor's in political science from the University of Michigan. Check.
Thank you very much, Mark. So what I want to do is shift the focus a little bit. So Mike and Peter gave wonderful talks, and they focus for the most part on factors that relate to those who participate in violent extremism, right? So you could think of these as the fighters. Mike turned our attention to the importance of the innate human drive to do good in generating individual participation decisions, and Peter laid out some of the broad conceptual problems for how we define the field, right, and address some important issues relating to high politics and macro-level factors. And their talks highlight a focus in the field that leaves a gap, and that's the gap I want to focus on, which is they focus, and a lot of the field is focused on how you reduce or think about the willingness of potential participants to become actual participants, right? So what is it that takes someone on the margin from a potential extremist to an actual extremist? And I want to talk about something very different, which is what you could think of as the regulatory side of the problem. Right? The role of communities from which participants or potential participants in violent extremism are drawn. And these are communities that can influence individual participants directly through social sanctioning or just kind of culturating them into doing things other than being violent, or when people are looking like they're going to be violent or are engaged in violence, by sharing information with the security services on what's going on in the community. And so I want to walk you through a few results from 4 different countries that speak to the role of the broader community. And the reason I think this is critical in a setting like this is a small numbers problem, right? Your ability, or any organization's ability, to target the particular people who might turn into extremists is very small, right? Outside of the worst civil wars, it's a very small number of people in the relevant demographic group who actually participate. So targeting them in some ways is a quixotic task. But addressing the larger communities, that's something lots of people in this room know how to do. So the first and most important set of results on this is that decisions by non-participants can be a critical mediating factor in the ability of those wishing to engage in violent extremism to carry it out. So we've done a series of papers in Afghanistan and Iraq using data on combat incidents from various militaries, which show something kind of interesting, which is that small-scale aid projects are extremely violence-reducing when done in areas where there are sufficient forces to take advantage of any information that the population might share. And you see similar things in the US with respect to domestic policing. What you don't see in either of these countries is a violence-reducing effect from large-scale aid programs that generate employment. And so how do you make sense of that? Well, one thing might be what you're doing is you're not kind of substituting people out of participation in violent extremism through giving them jobs, as Mike explained, but what you're doing with the small-scale projects is you're earning a little bit of goodwill on the margins. So that's kind of interesting, and I'll talk in a minute about ways in which making it easier to share information reduces violence. The second set of findings is that reminding people about the costs of militancy substantially reduces support for it, right? As does the experience of militant violence in one's area. So we did large-scale surveys in Pakistan in 2009 and 12, about 19,000 people across the 2 surveys. And consistently in both surveys, we found a couple common things. One was that people living in areas that had experienced violent extremism, terrorism in the Pakistani case for the most part, were uniformly more negative towards the groups than people who lived in areas that had experienced less. And the effect was particularly strong among the poor. In Baghdad, from 2006 to 2010, the United States military funded surveys of about 6,000 to 9,000 people a month. And we've gotten the microdata from those surveys. And what we can show you is that in the week after a violent event in a given neighborhood, support for anti-government elements, that was the term used in the surveys, goes down. as does support for attacks on coalition forces. So when people experience violence in their area, support goes down. In Baghdad, that effect is all driven by the poor and lower educated people. Right? So that's not an effect that's coming from the middle class and the wealthy. It's coming off the poor, and I'll talk about where that might come from in a minute. What makes us think this is behaviorally relevant is that in Iraq for 2007 and 2008, we secured the release of data on the actual flow of information to US and Iraqi forces through the phone tip lines that were set up throughout the country. And what you see in these is in the week after there is killing of civilians by insurgents in a given province, the number of tips that are called in goes up. It's about a 0.1 standard deviation standardized treatment effect. And the opposite when coalition or Iraqi forces killed civilians. So people are responding in terms of their level of cooperation, at least in that war, with the security services in ways that are kind of rational given the costs that violent actors impose on them. Right? So you can get this kind of cooperation not just in terms of attitudes in communities, but apparently in terms of action. As I mentioned, these effects are much stronger among the poor and poorly educated, and let me kind of make this fairly specific. So in 2009 in Pakistan, we found this very strong negative correlation between, positive correlation between income and affect towards militant groups. Right? So the wealthy were generally more positive towards militant groups, and we asked about 4 different militant groups in 2009. That effect is all coming off the delta between the urban poor and everyone else. All right? So you don't get that gradient in rural areas, and in urban areas it's between the poor and the middle class and the wealthy. And if you look at where the violent events had been happening in the major cities of Pakistan in 2009, it was in areas where the poor were experiencing the costs. So when we went back in 2012, we did an experiment in the survey where we actually varied where people thought they sat in the income distribution. Right? So we gave people 2 different versions of an income question, one that kind of forced almost everyone into the lowest bin, and one that forced almost everyone into the highest bin. And we randomized this. And then, afterwards we told them a little bit about what we did. But between doing that and telling them what we did, we measured their affect towards militant groups. And making people feel like they were more on the margins economically reduced support for violent groups. And it did much more strongly if we had reminded them about how violent Pakistan was compared to its neighbors. Right? So if we told them Pakistan is more violent than Bangladesh, which it was in 2012, that effect of an income manipulation was much stronger. So again, the kind of poor and less educated are vulnerable. The last piece of evidence that getting this information, this cooperation from the non-participants in the community from which people are drawn can be very effective comes from work in Iraq on the impact of mobile phone expansion. So in Iraq between 2004 and 2009, basically the mobile phone network gets built out. It's non-existent at the start of 2004, or almost non-existent, and by 2009, almost the entire part of the country that's affected by violence is covered. And it turns out that pretty much any way you slice the data, when cell phone coverage goes in over an area, violence in that area drops. And it's a big effect. So if you look at an area where a cell phone tower is put in and it provides completely new coverage, and you compare that to an area where a cell phone tower is put in and it just deepens the coverage that's already there, you get a reduction in violence in the area where it goes down of about half the mean level of violence in those areas over a 150-day period. Right? So you're having a significant effect. Now, what's striking about this in Iraq is the insurgents in Iraq thought the cell phone network was a boon to their activities. Right? We spent a lot of time talking to the operators, and they were frequently threatened by various insurgent groups for not doing a good enough job of maintaining the network. And that's because it was very useful for things like fusing bombs and communicating with people running ambushes. So what this tells you is what happens when the tower goes in is those tip lines, access to them, becomes much, much safer. Right? You can reach out and share information if you're a member of the community who doesn't like what's going on much more safely when you can do it by texting in a message or calling from the safety of your own home versus going in to visit or seeing someone face to face. Now, that suggests the possibility of the community's decisions mediating violence. As I mentioned at the start, an important factor in that is the availability of security services to act on it. So we've done the same analysis in India with expansion of telecom coverage through the Universal Service Obligation Fund. And you don't see the same effect on Naxalite violence. And one interpretation of that, drawn from talking to police officers in some of the Naxal-affected states, is they just didn't have the capacity to act on information that came in. Right? They didn't have the mobility or the men to go out into the forest and act on things. And so we're currently investigating that in the Philippines. But across this set of results, I think the key takeaway is there's a margin for affecting violent extremism, the actual exercise of extremist violence, that comes not from affecting the people engaged in the activity, but that comes from working with the community that surrounds them. And it might seem trite to say, but it's not something we've really looked at in this field very much, and seems quite important, at least based on the places we've looked so far.
Thanks a lot, Jake. And now we're going to wind up with Dr. Rebecca Wolf, who's a leading expert on the drivers of youth violence. Currently, Rebecca is the director of Mercy Corps' Peace and Conflict Team, where she's developed and supported programs in various countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Kenya, Somalia, Guatemala, Syria, Liberia, Mali, Nepal, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Tajikistan, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. Dr. Wolf has taught at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School and at the Wagner School for Public Service at New York University. She received her PhD in social psychology from Harvard. Rebecca.
Okay. As we wait.
It's appropriate.
Security alert. Let's see. Well, I will. Okay. Well, I'll begin to talk what I can remember off the top of my head. And so I was going to start with some background, which many of you in this room already know about what were initially links between youth violence, or what people assumed were the links between youth violence and conflict. And so this became a big issue post 9/11 with the thinking about youth bulges, the work the World Bank did on this issue, particularly with Hendrik Erdahl's work, really started to point to the fact that if you had large cohorts of unemployed youth, you would also have more likelihood of civil war. And you saw a large number of countries that fell into civil wars had experienced decline, and this was correlated with the youth bulges. Part of that argument was thinking that in these places with low youth employment, there was a greed issue where militant groups could easily recruit young people by giving them a little bit of money. And that, because of those low labor costs, you had a huge amount of young people who would join these groups. And at Mercy Corps, we started questioning this jobs conflict link. And I'll say it was probably in about 2008. I think I wrote about 15 to 20 proposals in a 6-month period from various donors about let's have a job program to increase stability. And as I started looking into this more, I started to question what that link was. And as Peter mentioned, there's a big difference between the macro level data and the micro level data or individual data. When you look at global level data and even at national level data, you do see correlations between GDP and civil wars and youth bulges. However, if you started to look at individual motivation, individual data, so some of the data Jake mentioned, some of the work in Uganda that Chris Blattman and Jeannie have done, so different than their Liberia work, you saw that there wasn't a correlation between employment and engagement in violence. As Mark Summers often says, there's a lot of unemployed youth. And so if unemployment was the real driver for young people joining these movements, you would have a lot more people joining these movements. And as a psychologist, I started thinking about it, well, if it's not an economic reason, like maybe it potentially is, like joining a violent group is probably not a rational decision. It's not people making a cost-benefit analysis and deciding, yes, joining a militant group or some type of armed group, and those financial benefits are worth more than the cost of potentially getting killed. But that's, in a sense, since many of the economists were doing this research, that's how they were looking at the problem. Related to that, and that I was starting to think joining a violent group was much more of an emotional decision, Mercy Score started this research, and what we noticed is that most work in this field were development actors or researchers going to talk to other people in, say, Afghanistan or Somalia or Kenya, and asking people why they thought other people joined violent groups. Very rarely in many of the youth assessments that I saw were people actually talking to individuals involved in armed groups. And what we noticed was a huge, what I call a self-other difference. If you talk to someone about why they think other people join violent groups, it's often an instrumental reason. It's based on material gains. If you talk to someone who's been involved in violence, it's often much more of an emotional decision. It's about injustice. It's about trying to, the pro-social reasons that Mike mentioned earlier. And so for Mercy Corps, we've made an explicit decision to base our research really talking to people, and particularly young people, who have been involved in violence. And so I'm going to focus on our quantitative work in this area. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good news about what works in terms of the evidence until the very end. So with Mercy Corps, we developed a bunch of theories of change to begin testing, particularly around youth employment and stability. And actually, so the research started looking just at political violence, and particularly electoral violence, and that was in Kenya. And there we actually did see a correlation between employment and participation in the electoral violence. And in that case, what we felt was that given that financial incentives were used, it was a short blip of violence, there was very material benefit for a brief period of time. And so there it made sense that there was a correlation. In Somalia, we used similar measures, and so I should say all these studies used similar measures. We found no correlation in Somalia between employment and participation in political violence. What we saw as the strongest correlation was between discrimination. So experience of discrimination made you were also more likely to engage in political violence. We had one counterintuitive result in that study in where young people who were more politically or civically engaged were also more likely to engage in political violence. And again, going to what Mike said earlier, we do think there are just so few opportunities in a place like Somalia to create change. Young people who are politically engaged or civically engaged also probably are the ones who want to make change. And so that is their only recourse for making change in those countries. We had this grand hope that we could basically, if we did a multi-country study, so we used Afrobarometer data in 13 countries to analyze some of these patterns, and we thought maybe we could see if like a political system or whether or not there were ideological conflicts there versus more of this electoral violence, could we come up with some type of framework for understanding the drivers of youth violence? Unfortunately, it was a bit of a mess. We did find some correlates. Oddly enough, out of the 13 countries, the strongest predictors we got, or correlates we got, were corruption and experience of violence. And so, Jake, I would like to potentially talk about there. We found the more you experience violence, the more likely you were to engage in violence. And so, but there could be contextual reasons for those differences. But there we often see, is it because of protection, and often joining a violent group is a way of gaining protection. But even in those two correlates, that was only 6 of the 13 countries. Not one correlate was significant in more than that. In that study, the only place where there was a correlation between employment and participation in violence was in Liberia. Kenya, which had been significant in 2007, was no longer significant in 2011. 13 was the Afrobarometer data. And oddly enough, Liberia had switched. It hadn't been significant in 2007 and now was significant. So all of the studies I've mentioned so far have been correlational studies, cross-sectional analysis. As Mercy Corps is an implementing organization, we do want to try to come up with interventions about what works. With DFID, we had implemented a large-scale vocational program in Afghanistan. And DFID their strategy in Afghanistan was stability. And they felt this vocational program was one piece of that puzzle. And so we used in our impact evaluation, we looked at, did improved employment affect affect support of armed opposition groups? The program was hugely successful, again, as like Mike talked about, in terms of a lot of other World Bank programs, in terms of getting young people jobs and improving their economic opportunities. So 80% in Helmand were employed after the program. It had absolutely no effect on attitudes and support of armed opposition groups. We are now, with USIP, doing a randomized controlled trial of a very similar program in Kandahar. With that, we are also doing a cash transfer condition to compare vocational training, cash, and whether, if it's about the financial incentives, maybe it's about meaningful employment. So we're trying to tease that apart. The last study there, many of you might have seen, our Youth and Consequences study, which was a qualitative study that summarizes the Somalia and Afghanistan work with Colombia. But what might work? So actually with students of Jake's, we had looked at some data from a large USAID program, civil society building program in Iraq. And we got a surprising result that also gives us a little bit of hope. And so what we found is that we had a natural experiment there. So basically, we had data from before Maliki resigned and after Maliki resigned and a body was put into the presidential role. And so what we see is that perceptions of governance actually improves with Maliki's resignation, and support of armed opposition goes down. And these are for Sunnis, not Shia. And what also gives us some optimism about these results is that Abadi is also Shia. So potentially, while sectarianism is still important in Iraq, perceptions of governance is maybe not more important, but is very important in terms of how people will both perceive the government and potentially reduce their support of armed opposition groups. So with that, what don't we know? So there's a lot we don't know. I'm going to pick out 4 areas based on some initial research we've done where we would like to do more. And so I do think there are probably cases where financial incentives may be an effective tool for reducing recruitment. So we have done a qualitative study on Boko Haram, and so a very different context than where a lot of these other VE groups hold reign. And so what we found there was that loans were actually quite effective recruitment tool, and that it was actually almost mafia-like situation where they would offer a young person a loan, and then when you couldn't pay it, they had to join. This was not and most of the people who took loans already had jobs and already had businesses, and they wanted to expand their businesses. Part of our speculation with that is because of the difference in political economy where Boko Haram is compared to where a lot of other groups are, such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is that the stronger capitalist system and strong inequality in Nigeria recruiters have figured out how to tweak that motivation for their advantage. In terms of counter narratives, in this Boko Haram research, we also found the first place where we have seen some evidence where counter-narratives work. And they were very locally based, and they were done through traditional and religious leaders. It wasn't from outside actors. And what was interesting is that the message that these leaders were giving was that basically Boko Haram is just as corrupt or more corrupt than the government, because everyone in Nigeria also recognizes the government is quite corrupt. But when we looked at resilience factors, so that was the difference in this Boko Haram study for us, was that we actually not only looked at the drivers for why youth participated, but what helped people resist. And a number of young people mentioned these counter-narratives as helping them resist or influencing their resistance to joining Boko Haram. The third piece is addressing grievances through service provision. So the research I just put up was about perceptions on service provision. The question is, how long does the Iraqi government have before they have to start delivering on that hope, before people become frustrated once again? We saw those protests this summer, where in the early fall, where people were already showing a bit of frustration, and people often there isn't a long time horizon. And so there's another area where we need to look at, because it's these grievances that tend to be most powerful. We also found in this Boko Haram study was that these grievances gave this kind of permissive regulatory, the regulatory piece that Jake mentioned about how the community allowed a group to come in or not. And so if those grievances are better addressed, perhaps that would create a more community resilience to VE groups coming in. I agree with Jake very much so that doing targeted youth programming may not be most effective, because you are looking for needles in a haystack. Few young people actually participate in these movements. But if you can improve community resilience for allowing VE groups to come in and recruit, you may have more luck. I think the last piece that I wanted to mention is social networks. And what we've seen with social networks, though, is that it goes both ways. And I think they both lure young people into groups, but also provide a protective factor to keep them out of those groups. And so as implementers, we need to figure out how we best work with, how do you best create pro-social networks so that you can continue to protect people from joining these groups. With that, I will end, and to Mark.
Great. Thank you very much. Now, I could take the privilege of the floor and start asking my own questions, but instead, we have two mics here. And so what I suggest is that those who have questions line up, and we'll start right in. And then if there's a gap, I have a few questions. But we have... Go ahead.
Hi, this is a question addressed to the whole panel. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how the heterogeneity and the political beliefs of armed groups, and particularly violent extremist groups, how that heterogeneity plays into both the way that you might demobilize members and the way that they react. I'm thinking specifically about some of the work that Elizabeth Jean Wood does, looking at kind of the different profiles and repertoires of violence of groups. And I see a clear difference in recruitment tactics from a Boko Haram that uses exploitative financing to basically forcibly recruit members versus those who willingly and because of ideology join groups very much along the lines of what Michael Gilligan described.
And also introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Jocelyn Kelly from Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Thank you.
Why don't we take three at a time?
Thank you. My name is Derek Müller. I'm with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. First of all, thanks to the very interesting set of very different but all equally interesting presentations. I was particularly impressed by the last speaker who can dwell on such a rich basis of evidence that makes discussions really interesting. It's actually not a question I want to make, but a comment. It would apply to probably all the panelists, but in particular to the second speaker. And I'm saying this from a purely development agency's perspective. we at SDC find it very important to distinguish between countering and prevention of violent extremism. Now, I know that you can argue that countering is broader and would include prevention, but we realize that this won't work in the field. We need to specify. It's crucially important if you're a field project manager. It's crucially important whether you're perceived as being in the countering or in the preventing business. And I just want to underline how just important this P versus V distinction is in our work. And I take the opportunity to underline that very recently, about a month ago, the OECD members, when discussing the ODA eligibility of interventions, they were very, very clearly specifying that whatever is C is not eligible. It's only about the V that makes your operations eligible. So those who still use the P rather the V, I think should also change their wording if they want to apply for ODA eligibility. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Peter Baumann. I recently completed a regional risk assessment of Lake Chad for USAID, and I designed the Peace Through Development program for the Sahel, the second one, PDEV2. I have two kind of comments and statements that I found in Lake Chad Basin that I'm curious about. And it makes me a little nervous. If we spend all our time trying to figure out exactly why Boko Haram or other extremist groups recruit, they're 10 steps ahead of us because they have access to the local population. So what I found with Boko Haram is there was an enormous amount of push and pull factors, if we'll call them that, and drivers that Boko Haram or just illicit groups could use. There's an enormous amount. And so if they couldn't provide a loan to the family to join, and we're not just talking about youth, Boko Haram provided loans to families to come from Niger. And they were not violent to begin with. They were violent in reaction to the predatory state. So if loans don't work, then they put a gun to your mom's head and say, you join. Right? So they're very, very adaptive. So by the time we do all this research, they're already figuring out another way to maintain their power. The second question is in terms of intervention. Like I said, I designed PDEV2, and implementation, with all due respect to my colleagues, didn't go so well. And so even if we can figure out how to intervene, are we set up and are the government set up to actually implement the interventions effectively? Are our budgets accurate? Do we have the money? Do we have the time frame? And do we have the larger outlook that other actors like, say, Saudi Arabia or Qatar have in terms of their influence in the region?
Why don't we start? Do the reverse. Rebecca, why don't you start, and we'll go right down the line. You don't have to answer every question, but the ones that you want.
Yeah. So, Jocelyn, so we'll be doing a full release of this Boko Haram report next month, but in that we do talk about this, in a sense, continuum between forced recruitment and voluntary recruitment, and we recognize that line isn't so clearly cut. And so, for example, someone taking a loan, is that voluntary recruitment, or is that because they've now have a gun to their head because they can't pay back the loan, is that forced? And so we talk about that continuum and also what that would mean for reintegration. Because one of the issues, what we're seeing in Nigeria is that depending on your role within Boko Haram affects how the community will accept you coming back. And so we are looking at how we may use that, thinking through that continuum to help design reintegration programs. So Peter, yes, you're right that these groups are, they're savvy. They know what levers to pull to recruit. necessarily. But I do believe that we're never going to get to the second part of your question if in terms of implementation, if we don't at least have some semblance of what those potential levers are, recognizing that they are going to be multidimensional. I think, for me, the bigger issue around implementation is how do we cooperate with security forces that also can, because of civilian casualties, in a sense, create more of the problem that we're trying to solve. And so here is, again, going to Eric's comment around prevention versus countering. I think potentially most of where development actors are probably better placed is that prevention space, and that type of development, or the, as Peter mentioned, the CVE relevant than trying to, like, in a sense, pull people out of one of these groups.
Yeah, so I think to be brief, I think Jocelyn raised a really important point, which is that the range of motivations and kind of larger causes to which groups aspire to get people to participate and engage in activity is large, as is the range of interventions or policies that they use to try and bring people in. One implication of that is if there are political grievances that are being used to rally people that international development actors can address, that seems like an important place to begin. And that ranges from local resource grievances up through the kinds of high-level politics that Rebecca and her team's work shows can have a huge impact on attitudes about extremist groups. Right? So what did they find in Iraq? Just to reemphasize, among the Sunni population, the unexpected turnover of the leader led to something like a 50% reduction in expressed support for extremist groups. So that's kind of amazing. And if you recall the history of that, that was very much something that was pushed for and brokered by the international community. Right? So there are ways in which the international community, including development actors, can potentially address some of these political grievances that aren't quite what we normally think about when we think about VE.
Thank you for the questions. To our Swiss colleague, I concede the point. We could split semantic hairs over CVE versus PVE. At the end of the day, I'm a pragmatist. I'll use whatever term is best understood. But your point is very well taken. To Peter, research puts us a step behind. I agree, but the choice is to do research or not do research. I mean, it's in my self-interest to say do the research. And the idea that PDF2 didn't go so well, are you saying that on the basis of the results of the evaluations that came back? Okay. I think through PDF2 we learned a lot about doing CVE in the Global South. There's a sense in the social sciences that a non-result is a result, and I thought the evaluation research that was done, helped us learn a lot, and is something that there should be more of rather than less. Right, okay, yeah.
Mike?
Okay, thanks for the questions. I mean, if I could just combine a bit the first two. There are, of course, lots of reasons why people end up in these groups, not just the ones that I really wanted to stress. And I think the ones that I did stress are in many ways the most intractable, right? How do you keep young people from, doing these things, even leaving England and France to join these organizations? Is quite obviously a very different dynamic from somebody who's doing it because a gun is being held to their head. And so I think, and this brings me to the second point, which is if we just jump in there and just, there's a real temptation in the programming community to just get in there and do something, right? Because they're one step ahead of us already. And if 99% of the things that you are doing are not addressing the problem, then that's, there could be unintended consequences that are even worse. So I actually think it's the nature of the beast that we're always going to be one step behind on, maybe on the problem you're worried about, but somebody else's problem is going to be helped by this research down the road. And I just don't think there's any other way of doing this other than the way we're currently doing it. So I'm sorry your program didn't work, and that we didn't have much to say about it. But if we learned something about why it didn't work, I'm not sure that's true or not, then that's a mistake somebody else doesn't have to make down the road. I mean, I just think that's just the nature of the way learning is done. But again, and I think it ties into the other point, which is these are complex problems in which people join for a bunch of different reasons. I talked about one very specific reason, and the program that you design to address that reason is going to be a completely different program to one where people are joining these things because Boko Haram is holding a gun to your mom's head, right? And so until we know which of those is operative in each of these cases, and until we've studied what the different potential solutions to those problems are, your program isn't going to work. On the CPV, whatever, CP versus whatever, C versus P, I mean, I think this is a really good point, and I think it's something that we have to be really careful about. When you're going into these places, are you trying to prevent violent extremism, or are you trying to combat it? Because if you're trying to combat it, well, then you're sort of doing the things that Jake is talking about, where you're asking your neighbors to drop a dime on somebody, right? And that's, if you're going in there and building a school and then winking and sort of saying, hey, did you like the school? Would you mind telling me, who are members of Taliban around here? That's not, almost by its very nature, a long-run solution to these problems. And the other issue is, which we know from Stavros' work and a lot of other people's work, is that people use these tip lines for all sorts of reasons besides going after the bad guys, right? They use them because they want the guy's goats, or because their son flipped them off on any number of reasons, right? And so I think that's great, and that these are working, and I hope they will continue to work. But and I know that it is a needle in the haystack problem, but that's why I've chosen to concentrate on what is motivating people to join these things, because I think getting neighbors to rat on each other, and that's my terminology, not yours, makes things very difficult from a development standpoint, and I think that was the tenor of the question. And it also has all of these other potentially pernicious consequences. So it's not to say we shouldn't be doing it. I mean, if it's working, great. But I've heard enough about drone strikes in bad places, and on innocent people in some of these places, that I don't want to have anything to do with it personally. So that's my 2 cents.
We have 3 more questions here. Why don't we start?
Thank you. Thank you. And I agree with that. So I'm Gary Slutkin. I'm the Executive Director of Cure Violence. And we have a lot of experience in the gang and cartel space and in election violence, and we're just starting to get into this realm. And can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
And so this was a terrific panel, and I just love what you guys are exploring. I just want to add some things, then just ask something, and I'll try to be quick on this. This pro-social stuff is really central. These guys are doing things for reasons. And so our approach is this infectious disease control, epidemic control system, which has interrupters and then does community level norm change and a lot of behavior change. And so what we found kind of accidentally, in a way, is that interrupters themselves and people involved in this system become superheroes themselves, and people want to do that. And so I'm wondering, in a way, whether you've seen any of this on the ground. The other thing that I wanted to come to is that we're also finding that, yes, it's not economic, and even it's like one or more of you said, everybody's got a grievance. I don't know anyone in this room doesn't have a grievance. But the data on violence really shows up that the greatest predictor of whether someone does violence is whether they've been exposed to it and whether their friends are doing it. In other words, it's behaving primarily as a contagious process. And so when you ask people who are involved in contagious processes, whether it's TB or cholera or violence, they don't ordinarily tell you the reason of how they're, in a way, following what other people are doing. So some of this research that misses just the contagious nature of it, I think. So and I just want to say that this interrupter set works on trying to find the local explanations and the counter narratives as it goes. So I think it's a nice mix of the research and the exploration. And I would love to work with several of you on trying to come to interface on some of these issues. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Genesis Lazo, and I'm a Peace Building Fellow from George Mason University. We've heard of a lot of the negatives so far, and I'm curious, while you guys are out there doing research, what have been some positive examples of conflict resolution or conflict prevention, whatever you may wish to call it, that we can sort of take with us as we leave here? I actually interned for a nonprofit under PDEV too. So it's quite depressing to know that all the work that I compiled is apparently not good. So I would love to take away something positive, and hopefully you guys have something that you can share with us as to how the conflict resolution field is actually worth it. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Naila Ahmed. I am with World Bank. I work on Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, I mean, this presentation was really good, and I think maybe it's because we're hearing outside voices. We tend to, in the World Bank, just listen to ourselves, and it's the same messages. So I really enjoyed this presentation. I have two questions. One is, how would you suggest we apply some of these ideas you have in our actual projects that we implement on the ground? And also the second one is, who is actually best suited? You know, maybe our client is the government when we work. So are we really suited to be the ones trying to influence change in people's minds or trying to, prevent people from joining groups? So I'll give you two examples of what I work on in Afghanistan. So I'm managing this program called the National Solidarity Program. It's been going on for 12 years. It's one of the biggest programs in the country. It's in every village. We've developed, okay. So, you have development councils in every village. We're trying to build infrastructure, deliver services, bring the face of the government to the ground. But we did an impact evaluation, and we found that it's only when you're there and money is coming through and you're engaging, that's when the perception of the government is positive. The minute you're not, it goes away. But it's very expensive to do this kind of stuff for 50 years, right? The second thing is, last December, we were asked by the government to start this Jobs for Peace program. So, coming back to your presentation, it's, $100 million they've given us to generate quick jobs in the country so that, you prevent conflict, you prevent people from joining the Taliban or whatever. So we do infrastructure well, we do service delivery well, we do jobs, we build institutions. But I would like to ask you specifically, like if we had to incorporate some of your ideas into our operations, what exactly would you suggest?
We have three last questions. I'm going to suggest that we take them, and then you all pick and choose. This young lady.
Hi, thank you. My name is Emmanuel Chou. I work here in the FCV unit, and I would like to share with you one of our key findings from our 2 weeks field mission in Tunisia, where we were working on the questions of violent extremism. And what we find out from many NGOs that work directly with the youth that is being radicalized and recruited is that if international development actors really want to do an efficient work, we need to all work together and to build an integrated approach, because this is really a multi-factor phenomenon. And we had many examples where if, for example, you have an NGO that's coming in and try to do sensitivity work by talking to people, it doesn't work, because then the young person is telling you, yeah, but then what? What am I going to do? I'm still in the street. And if you come and you just give a job, like, for example, a very funny if I can say, example was that the Tunisian government tried to solve the problem by hiring thousands and thousands of young people and give them civil servants job. But they actually didn't have anything to do, so they were still being at the cafe and not doing anything. And so I would like you to have comment on this, the possibility of building an integrated approach, and that address both the material and the psychological aspect of the drivers. And if you think that the word exclusion could actually be the keyword around which we could build that framework. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sam Chittick. I work for the World Bank, specifically on the Philippines program. So 2 questions. One is the reaction to the change in national government was fascinating. Has anyone looked at the degree to which the nature of local government and whether or not it is representative of communities actually affects the kind of the environment for recruitment or for violent extremism? Because it would seem to be that would be one of the key criteria in discussing exclusion inclusion. The second one was, there seems to be a direct contradiction between your first point here on the financial incentives that might work and the general consensus that job programs don't work. And I take your point that there are specific cases in which financial examples can be in loans and so on can be used. But did you mean to say that you're going to be looking at financial incentives more broadly, or specifically in the cases where you have around Boko Haram about the exploitation of financial vulnerability? Because if not, then it would seem to be some kind of a contradiction between the earlier points. And from the bank's perspective, we've been doing job programs, and there has been an inbuilt assumption that they're going to work. They're going to have some impact. It was very useful to have that illustration earlier on. Thanks.
Let me just say that on the point that you made about inclusion, this morning's session, the former Prime Minister of Tunisia, as well as Danilo Turk, in terms of their own work, including Madrid, that the emphasis was, in fact, on finding ways for both the reality and the perception of inclusion to be changed, because the lack of it, the sense of exclusion among a variety of groups, they saw as a major factor for pushing people towards the extremist organizations.
And just quickly,
And the need for the World Bank and development organizations to help governments find ways to include, in fact, those population groups.
Right. So, for example, there are some areas where local governments are able to work with traditional leadership models, and they become part of the local government structure. So, in those areas, it'd be fascinating to know whether it has an impact or not on
recruitment, et cetera. Yeah. Okay. No more. Well, let's have you finish what you have there, and then we'll take the last 3. Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead. You're anxious? Go ahead.
Not particularly. I'm just wondering who should start.
Rebecca's
Okay.
Rebecca's
So I guess maybe I'll try to in reverse order. So to Sam, your question about is it contradictory? I think when we first started this work, it's not that jobs aren't at all part of, or financial incentives are at all part of it. I think there is just such a heavy weighting on jobs compared to the other pieces of the puzzle in that initially. And so we wanted to start raising a question about maybe we needed to have a more holistic program, as Emmanuel, you were mentioning. And so I think that's part of it. We're also trying to see if, again, can we come up with a framework for understanding why some incentives are going to work for recruitment under different conditions? And so we've literally just playing with it in the last couple of weeks around political economy. And so thinking about a Nigeria, which is a much stronger capitalist system, less centralized government and centralized government providing services, say, versus in many of the places in the Middle East where a lot of these groups have functioned. And they actually, part of their ways of getting support is providing services, which Boko Haram doesn't do as much of. So we're trying to think through that political economy of incentives to see if that helps us explain some of these differences between recruitment tactics. In the Afghanistan study impact evaluation, we did look at differences between national and local government support because it was a vocational program under the local government or the at the government level and below. we did not see any differences. We saw more support for local government as a result of the program, but it didn't affect support for there was no correlation with armed opposition groups. Emmanuel, I think you're right, it is about a holistic program because this is multidimensional. A program that, it wasn't around CVE, but the Yes Youth Can program funded by the US government in Kenya was actually multidimensional. It did have strong impacts around reducing participation in the last election, participation in violence in the last election, and also the US government has been pretty supportive of holistic programming in the youth space, and they have the Youth Power IQC that is both in Kenya and will be going in other countries. So you do see more of that holistic programming. I think where we need to see more integration now is between development programming, which may help improve, say, community resilience to some of these violent extremist forces, and then layering that where there is violent extremism, maybe more of that countering work, and then rehabilitation work. So also looking at all three of those levels where we need to see more integration. I think I'll take Genesis's question because I'm probably the strongest practitioner of the panel. I mean, I think, and we can talk more offline, the Yes Youth Can program was quite successful. I think what we're also seeing is how do you manage conflicts? So, for example, in Iraq, we've had a very successful conflict management program resolving disputes around the country. How do we use that kind of managing disputes so they don't become violent, again, and keeping cohesion in those places so violent extremist groups don't have as many grievances to manipulate to gain support.
Jake?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think to be very brief, the question that was present in a lot of that last set of questions was kind of what are the productive things to do? And something that comes out of this panel is that it depends a lot on what you think is the mechanism that you can affect. So if you want to shift the preferences in the population, right, then there are things you might do on that, and it may be that some of the job training type things do shift that, even if they don't shift attitudes among participants differentially from non-participants. Just to give a quick example, we did a vocational training program recently in the four poorest districts of southern Punjab, and in the places in the villages where a training center was put into the village as opposed to giving people vouchers for training, there's like a 20 percentage point swing in vote share for the ruling party in the 2013 election. So that's massive, right? That's a huge political change from putting a very cheap little training center where you did some training and stitching in a village. So you can clearly affect political preferences if you think that's going to be useful. That's a thing development actors can do. Giving people meaningful nonviolent things to do is another thing that can be done. It requires a different emphasis on what's in the programs. But running throughout the theme of this panel is there's not like a one answer, and so you have to do the kind of hard work, I think, to figure out what's going to be useful in your context, and then hit that margin hard. There are clearly ways it can be done, and so there's certainly lots to do that's productive. It shouldn't be a depressing panel.
Also on Genesis, your question, it's the Homer Simpson question, right? Can't win, don't try. And you're right, human history is an unrelenting bloodbath, but there is some variation in that. And we should try to figure out what drives that variation. With this current study that we're doing, fortunate to have the opportunity to do field work in Tanzania, where, that notion of national resilience really does stand out. The previous field work I was able to do was in Burkina Faso. An extremely poor country, a PDF2 country, but a really remarkable little place that has just gone through as successful a democratic transition as we've had perhaps continent-wide for a very long time. Obviously suffered a shocking terrorist attack recently, but it was foreigners attacking foreigners at a place where foreigners hang out. And Ouagadougou is a city that's, it's a big city with lots of vulnerability. So there is something there that warrants the work that we're doing. And in this regard, the turn to CVE or the turn to prevention, to acknowledge the point made previously by our Swiss colleague, is really very important. I do think the sort of first post 9/11 decade of counterterrorism probably at the end of the day made matters worse in a lot of different parts of the world, and maybe that's putting it mildly. The shift to prevention also forces governments and international organisations to ask hard questions about the consequences of their actions, and whether indeed counterterrorism does have unintended consequences, and that's a very productive development as well.
So thank you. I mean, a lot of what I was going to say has been sort of hinted at. I mean, there are cases of personal experiences that I've had that, I actually sometimes get a little choked up when I tell them, because I remember one day I was talking to Prachanda, who was the head of the Nepalese rebellion. He was sort of I guess the closest thing we have to a living Che Guevara today. And the kind of, and this guy never gave up on, his life is dedicated to the oppressed masses. There's no question about that. But he learned, and one of the main things that made him learn that violence was not the answer was, there was the king in this little Nepalese history, the king in Nepal way overplayed his hand. The parties decided that they were going to make peace with the Maoists, and the king could go to hell. And they did that. And the parties got together. The Maoists organized this massive general strike. They shut the country down, and they achieved more in 10 days than the Maoist rebellion, non-violently, than the Maoist rebellion had achieved in 10 years of fighting in the bush. And I think that was a real lesson for him. And when he talked about it, he was getting a lot of flack in his party for giving up violence too quickly. And he sort of said, but a party leader has to have the courage to change his party and himself. So he had undergone this transformation. He had learned somehow that violence was, in the 21st century, he came to realize that, a Maoist revolution is not going to help the oppressed classes. And he said, Marx is not a cookbook. It's the purpose is to aid the oppressed classes, and in the 21st century, revolution is not the way to do that. So people can learn, and he did, and completely changed, the history of that country as a part of it. But I mean, that's just sort of an ad hoc example. But I mean, it's not to say that good things can't come out of all of this. To your question, I mean, that's a big question, right? And the small answer is what Jake said, which is, well, the short answer is yes, you should be doing more of this holistic program. Just jobs is not going to do it, right? So you need to have that social component. The good news is that a lot of the people that are joining these organizations are basically good people who want to help out their communities, right? And you should be able to tap in. They're not all psychopaths. Some of them are, but I mean, and is to find ways to tap into that, but there's not necessarily a general answer to that, right? Afghanistan is a difficult situation because, if you create organizations that are meant for them to help out their communities, the elephant in the room is still that there's all sorts of foreign troops running around that they think are invading their country, and they want to get rid of them, and that's something that you're not, that's sort of topic number A, and the only way you're going to deal with that is by attacking them, right? And so that's kind of a big problem. So I'm not sure there's an easy answer in that case. But in a lot of these cases, if you can get partnerships like they did with Boko Haram, to sort of say, look, this isn't what the Quran is telling you to do. There's another way. But again, it has to be from them. One of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen in my life is Tony Blair standing up in front of a Muslim group and sort of saying, I read the Quran, and jihad this isn't really what it means. It's like, who the hell are you? You're some Presbyterian. Why should I listen to you, right? So it has to come from the inside, right? But given that this crowd is not going to be able to do that, there are other things you can do. There are community service organizations that can tap into that to help development, to train kids. I mean, but you have to bring in there's a subset, it's not everybody. For some people, just giving them a job is plenty. I'd say for most people, just giving them a job is plenty. But there's some people who need that sense of meaning, and you're going to have to provide that for them or give them an attitude, a way of doing that some way. And the answer to how that is, I'm not so sure. I can tell you the World Bank had a nice, I'm done? Okay, sorry. The World Bank did have a nice program in Aceh, which was possibly a solution, but we can talk about that later.
All right, the two people that were up there was this young lady and this gentleman. So please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rufaida, and my question to you, Mr. Michael, on your first presentation about the motivation or for these people to join, and what we have seen that these extremist group are targeting young, professional, well-educated people who are could be like grown and lived most of their lives in European countries or United States or other developed countries, and is this questioning us to ask whether there's an issue with these communities to absorb these people, to get them like to change the way that they are thinking, or there's no research on this area, like how do they targeting groups that are really well educated, live most of their lives in a well-developed countries. Thank you so much.
And the last question to this gentleman.
Apparently, the question was just asked. You sure? Okay. Hi, I'm Olaf Jurgensen from UNDP, and thanks for the fabulously interesting presentations. I guess just really quickly, end of the day, youth for positive change. If there's research, if you're doing research on that, it's been mentioned. Social contracts, social cohesion has been mentioned, and how youth shapes that, because it seems like they're just this demographic and everything's targeting that, but there are societal factors around them and how they're shaping it both ways. And it just, I mean, and it probably goes, but Peter, you're talking about how we kind of get a conceptual head around what we're talking about. I know this is really early days. The research sounds super interesting, but I was just thinking more about in your earlier presentation, just about youth in a positive way and how it engages around the whole issue of power and shaping. Thank you.
The panel now can answer the questions and make any kind of final statements, and each has about a minute.
This young woman's direct question to me, there's not the kind of research that I've done with those groups, but I mean, that is exactly what I'm talking about, right? People leaving England, and I just heard today that ISIS had just executed 9 Danish men, you know, for cowardice or something. So the jobs are not the issue here. Now, there's something going on in their home countries, certainly. They feel marginalized, perhaps, any number of things. But these people are being radicalized by someone at home, and there needs to be other ways for them to get a sense that they can contribute to humanity besides that. And I don't know of studies that have done that. We've all heard that this is a needle in a haystack trying to find these folks, and the folks that I've found the needles have all come out of the haystack voluntarily by the time they've gotten to me, right? Because they're already in the movements. But yeah, I would suspect that the kind of thing that I'm talking about is geared toward precisely that sort of person. It would be great if someone could do a study of them. But they're going to be a little hard to get a hold of for the next few years.
Peter?
Just on youth, I wasn't quite sure what the question is.
More about the positive side of youth and just about you trying to get a theory of change. But we're talking, you're presenting a lot of great quantitative data, and it was just interesting if you're looking at youth in a different way. It's really the question about youth in a positive way, and how they're just, they seem to be the target of everything, of all our interventions, but it is a bigger governance issue. So it's just wondering if there's research, if you're heading that way in terms of your research. So maybe.
I'll be happy to stay and chat to you about that.
Love to.
Jake?
Best way to be brief.
No, thank you all for taking the time to talk with us today.
So on that note, yes, thanks for everyone for coming. I think it does become a more societal problem. And how do you build that social cohesion? And we saw both what are the resilience factors, both at the individual level, but also at a community level, and how do you build those? So yeah, those are ways that we are looking to go with our research.
I think we all should thank the panelists for fantastic